This country been run by a brother goats, the greediest of all time. They have all a self and none of the mentality. The chorus is bunch of pigs and goats running this desk here. And the latest deception and betrayal is really cause for alarm. They're the greediest of all time. It is plain to see the true gang and give a damn about you and me. Even big supporters crying foul and shame about his comrades dirty in the Labour Party name. Don't business about that as long as they pocket fat. Too bad who don't agree. The goat them say it's all about me. That's the chorus. Who is the nanny gate liar? Who talks spin doctor? Men, whose sole agenda is to make themselves richer and the poor harder. They say I know that I greedy, but I beg you don't watch me stop being hateful. Instead just be grateful. All the good them say it's all about me. That's the slogan. The big salary increase is just the latest injustice to be imposed on the people by these blundering misfits. They're selfish and greedy with no love for the needy. Grabalicious and run race, make the thing ain't got no taste. Disrespectful and pompous, arrogant and self-righteous. These goats too brave and bold, ain't got no heart, no soul. They fed on their own nest with not a care for the rest. They say it's all about me. That's the goat them mantra. Who are the whole hog treating poor people like dog men? Who keep flying high and start leaving our sons here to die? Who take the pepper, the pop and kill off the peace? Enough talking about lift and elevate, just words and promises but no relief. Who lacking empathy, compassion, humility, Who think that shame, lame, rename is a sustainable strategy? Here they got them men. But woe be unto these ghosts and vampires. Ecclesiastes 5 verse 10 says, whoever loves money never has enough. Whoever loves wealth is never satisfied with their income. Conversely, a grievous evil under the sun. Wealth brought to the harm of its owners, lost to misfortune, so that their children have nothing to inherit. So let them carry on. God don't like ugly. Who play, who fooling, who since June 2022? Who do the big bet and switch divide the poor and the rich? Who raking in bigly while so many going hungry? Who are disgrace of the eye blood sucking parasite, a bunch of termites?
We love to serve our country that God has blessed so well. In peace and love and happiness, we will forever dwell. We ask for God's protection and guidance on our way. The People's Action Movement will strive from day to day. The People's Action Movement is here and here to stay.
Hello everyone and welcome to another edition of Perspectives. In fact, this is edition number 6. We are so happy that you've made it here this evening. We know that you are all excited about the upcoming editions. We have seen your feedback. We have heard your feedback. Some of you are even asking for us to extend Perspectives. But we're looking to all of your suggestions down the road. We are so glad you can join us. On this edition, edition 6, we'll be talking about all of the work the People's Action Movement has done to transform and advance the working class in St. Kitts and Nevis. Yes, the working class, the casino workers, the security guards, the hotel workers. You know, the dust has just settled on the Workers' Day. On Monday, we saw people marching in the streets, and there have been a lot of talk about things that were not very factual. So along the way in the discussion, we are going to fact check a number of assertions that were made publicly that were not necessarily correct. There is the view that the People's Action Movement and the NRP in collision in the 1980s didn't do a lot for the working class. We are going to debunk that thought because that is the farthest thing from the truth. And so coming on the heels of the Workers' Day activities that were recently held on Monday this week, we thought that this is timely for us to have the discussion. My guest presenter is a lady who we know all too well. But before we get to her, let me let you, wonder who is the guest presenter tonight a little bit more. I want to invite the parents of children who were born probably they're mid or late millennials, or even the Gen Zers or the Gen Zs as you want to call them, those who were born 1995, 1996, or generally those who were born post-independence, to join this discussion. So if I'm a parent, if you're a parent looking at it, please call them up, have them have a seat. This series, this edition tonight, is going to be a veritable lesson of all of the things that jump-started the real work that benefited the working class in St. Kitts and Nevis during a PAM NRP administration. Thank you so much for joining us. And now I can introduce my guest. She really does need a lot of introduction. She is somebody who is well known. She has made a solid contribution in St. Kitts and Nevis over the last several years. She has taught, she has done a lot of other work that really has solidified her claim to be a decent citizen of St. Kitts and Nevis. In fact, she was the first female labor commissioner. I know I'm giving you all a bigger clue now. So join me in welcoming to this conversation our esteemed presenter tonight, Mrs. Gwendolyn Nisbett. Hi, Mrs. Nisbett. Welcome to Perspectives.
Hi, Laverne, and thank you very much for that kind introduction. I'm delighted to be here, and thank you for inviting me.
It is my pleasure. When we thought about tabling this discussion tonight, we couldn't think of anybody else other than you. In fact, we know that you, together with our dearest Dame Constance Mitchum, worked tirelessly to change these laws and to basically revolutionize the benefits that working class folks in St. Kitts benefited from in the 80s and in the 90s and up to today. And so we couldn't think of anybody else. After Dame Constance Sola, she wasn't available. We couldn't think of anybody else better than you, more fitting to educate and enlighten those people who still continue to believe that this party, our dear beloved People's Action Movement Party, cannot relate to the working class. When in fact, the records show that of all the parties that has ever been in government in St. Kitts and Nevis, the People's Action Movement in collision with the NRP has done more work for the working class than any other party. And we say that without fear of contradiction. As we go along tonight, if you still don't believe us, you are required to stay in your seat, stay put, and follow this conversation. Let us begin by showing the series of acts that governed the working class in St. Kitts over the years. We have a frame that we'll show you just now. And that frame is basically showing that the working class, the act actually had its beginning in 1937. And then its first amendment happened in 1976. Now, bear in mind that adult suffrage happened around 1952, if my history serves me right, and then there was statehood in 1967. if you can calculate the number of years that it took for a Labour Party administration to begin to address the issues of the working class, 1976. And then in 1986 rather, there were a number of other amendments, and henceforth after that. So the groundwork, we believe that the groundbreaking work that really started to pay attention and to give the rightful benefits to our working class really started in the Act number 6 of 1986. And our guest presenter this evening, Mrs. Nisbett, was one of the pivotal people who actually helped to craft that act. And so, Mrs. Nisbett, I want you now to, start off with giving us an opening statement, and then you could, if you will, you can segue into talking about what this Act of 1986, number 6 of 1986, really meant to the working class in that time in St. Kitts and Nevis. Welcome again.
Thank you so much, Laverne. And historical context is important, and that is where I wish to begin. In the 1980s, the International Labour Organization actually started putting their proposals together for the protection of workers. And one of the things that they did was to draft model legislation that could be used in the various countries. It meant that it would have to be tweaked to suit the socio-cultural situations of those countries. The gentleman who did an outstanding job was in charge of the ILO office in Trinidad, Mr. Ashley Leslie. And history will record that Sir Hugh Rawlings, then the Assistant Secretary in the ministry, traveled to Trinidad, met with Mr. Leslie, and actually discussed what the ILO was proposing. After his return home, he got the support of the Permanent Secretary, who was then Mr. George Bradley, and they did a lot of the groundwork along with Sir Tapley Seaton in seeing that legislation put together so that it could be of benefit to the workers. I'm saying basically that the government worked hand in hand with the ILO to make this a reality. Before that time, there were a lot of protections that did not exist. And this was one of the reasons why the International Labour Organization was concerned, and the PAM NRP government was also concerned that workers should have that protection. So, after the meetings, Mr. Leslie traveled to St. Kitts on at least 2 occasions to help to finalize. The ILO believes that no one party or group should determine what happens in terms of minimum wages. So therefore, tripartite groups were put together, and that was instructive. At the end of it, the government was able, using that model legislation, to come up with Act number 6 of 1986, which came into force to protect the workers in that particular year. In 1986, workers were then given the opportunity to ask for their terms and conditions of employment, and the Act compelled them as employers then to give that information within 14 days. There were so many other areas that were covered, but some of the striking ones were the protection of workers from dismissal. You couldn't be dismissed if you were seriously ill, if you were pregnant, if you were a member of a trade union movement, you could not be dismissed. And that says to you what used to happen in the past. That there were employers who would just send somebody home pregnant, send somebody a letter to say, well, your services are terminated while that person is ill. And as a result of that, protections were offered.
Were some of those employers possibly government? Because I've heard stories of people losing their job in those days. Well, let me not jump ahead. I can't wait to hear some of those stories, because I think that if we don't go on record by sharing some of these facts as a party, the misgivings and the lies, perhaps. I was looking for a softer word, but my vocabulary is not working with me tonight, would continue to perpetuate. Because what I'm hearing you say there is that this Protection of Workers Act that happened, that really took its place in 1986, happened at a time when even in the government, one could have lost their job hitherto if they became pregnant. Is that correct? Was that a fact then?
That is absolutely correct. Let me state further. I was teaching at the Bastia High School when a directive came from the Ministry of Education indicating to the principal that he was obliged to report if any unmarried female on staff was pregnant, because the services would have to be terminated. It started with sending people home indefinitely. You didn't really get your job back if you were not married and got pregnant. What a lot of women did was either to get married very quickly, which they term shotgun weddings, or some resorted, unfortunately, to abortions. Others caught a plane and left the country. And that represented a brain drain, because I could recall one of my teachers did just that. And she was so good. But she was pregnant, not married, and her parents needed to protect her. They flew her off the island. The Labour government in the 1970s decided to make a change. So then women were not dismissed once they became pregnant. They were told, you have to go home for a year. And my understanding is that at the end of that year, when they returned, they had to start at the bottom of the scale.
It didn't matter where they were before they were sent home.
No, it didn't.
Wow.
That's my understanding. And I know of people who had to spend that year at home. That's a fact.
Look how far we've come. Look how far the People's Action Movement, in coalition with the NRP, has brought this country. And I am one of those people who firmly believe that we have reason as a party to march on Workers' Day, because we need to bring to the attention of the young people, those people who are born post-independence, those people who were born in the 90s and even more recently, that it is because of forward-thinking legislation that we can enjoy the benefits of continuous employment in the civil service, even as we are pregnant. And this is not a thing to sneeze at. What you just said for me was very alarming. The fact that people had to leave or maybe have abortion. I'm a woman, and I could not imagine living in those times. Those times sound, I don't know, it sounded almost like a system in Russia, and I've never lived in Russia. But it really to me, what must have been a very intimidating time to be a civil servant, much less if you had ambition to climb the ranks in the civil service. So this conversation is really to set the record straight, and I'm hoping that the parents who are listening would gather around their children, many of whom may probably still be in the civil service, and can in fact do so because of those groundbreaking legislation that the People's Action Movement, in coalition with the NRP, brought to the fore to basically liberalize and bring greater freedom to its civil servant. But I want us to dial back a little bit more, Mrs. Nisbett, to talk about the minimum wage, because I think when they say people who don't know the history may repeat it or be doomed by lack of knowledge, something to that extent, because we, in recent times, and as recent as last weekend, leading up to all the activities that happened on the first Monday in May, we heard a lot of untruths and a lot of disinformation and misinformation. And it is the reason why we thought, it is about time that PAM goes on record to set the record straight and to share this kind of information. So I want you to dial back a little bit more and speak of what happened in that same act that created one of the iterations to change the minimum wage then.
Okay, but Laverne, before I dial back, let me just add that if the woman in the civil service was pregnant for a gentleman in the civil service, she was sent home, but he was not. So there was that serious discrimination.
Oh my goodness.
Yes. Now, in terms of the Labor Minimum Wage Act, we go back in history again. If you recall, St. Kitts led the way with the 1930s riots. And what happened in St. Kitts was revolutionary, and it spread to the other islands. We're speaking of the 1930s. The British government was then in charge of our countries. What did they do? They realized the seriousness of the uprising and wanted to pacify the workers. So what in fact they did was to pass an act. They passed that act in 1937. It came into force on the 13th of December, 1937, and it was entitled the Labor Minimum Wage Act. So by putting this act in place, it was felt that the workers would say, okay, we agitated, and here we have a positive response. It was worth it. Now, that Minimum Wage Act only covered shop workers. Other workers were left out of the picture. And what we have to understand is when you say minimum, it means you should not be paying less than that figure. Okay? Workers went through a lot of horrific experiences even after the 1930s riots. What I will say about that act is that when successive governments came into office, they made amendments. They made important changes. But when the PAM NRP government came into office, the largest number of changes were made. If you recall, I said only shop workers were covered under that act. Under the PAM NRP government, they included hotel workers, workers on the industrial site. The shops were included, yes. Domestic workers, hotel and casino workers, yes. Security guards. So it was greatly expanded. I had the privilege, as the Labor Commissioner at that time, to convene that tripartite meeting and to sit as the negotiations continued towards giving us that new act of 1994.
1994. 1994 is what, 30 years ago, if my math is correct. So since 1994, and PAM, I think PAM left office in 1995. So
Yes.
So we now see that statements that I'm going to show in this clip upcoming is really untruthful and misleading. We'll look at this.
We are the only party that has ever made it better for you financially. Minimum wage has only been increased under Labour.
Did you hear that? Minimum wage has only increased under Labour. Now, this is one of the things that we want to fact check, and clearly you have blown it away already. But I just want you to emphasize again, because you see, you know, it's one thing about winning hearts and minds in politics, but you can't do so if you're untruthful. And in a day and age when I don't know if because our people don't like to read, and I think when we were talking early on, we were saying that I guess we come from an oral history kind of background. You know, we sat on the back steps at night under the moonlight and listened to our grandparents tell us stories, and I don't know if you don't hear those stories told orally, then people seem not to be inclined to read them in a textbook. And maybe this is an oral, you know, oral lesson tonight as well, because clearly, for a responsible politician to get on a platform and say something that is so clearly untrue, really ought to be you know, condemned, because you know, as a former teacher himself, he must know that if you are going to educate people, you must be truthful in your education. So I just I'll allow you to respond to that untrue and misleading claim, Mrs. Nisbett.
Laverne, I am going to give Minister Jeffrey Hanley grace. I'm going to give him grace because I have known him as a devout Anglican. He is also the Minister of Ecclesiastic Affairs. I would say that somebody gave him misinformation, but Minister Hanley has a duty to fact check before he makes a statement. I thought it was so unfortunate.
Terribly unfortunate, if I might add. And I hope that people who are listening this conversation on Perspectives now know better. Because sometimes, like you say, one has to provide historical context. Because if you don't, you will continue to live a lie and believe a lie. And it is often said that if you allow people to go on in ignorance, you know, they can only speak and breathe and speak ignorance thereafter. And that is why I think that this show Perspective would over time become so very useful, because we're going to fact check them. We're going to keep them honest. And if ever there's a time for ministers in government to be honest, it is now, because we are going to be listening to you and we're prepared to fact check you and tell the people what the true story is. So we are putting people on notice now. Tell the people the truth. Tell the people the truth, because we will find the facts and we will share the facts and the people will decide thereafter. So you're basically saying that 1994 Act expanded the beneficiaries of persons who benefited from minimum wage. Yes. Was there anything that stood out in that act for you? Anything else?
I think basically that the process by which we came up with getting that act off the floor was very, very important. We invited the Trades and Labor Union to that meeting. The manufacturing division of the Chamber of Industry and Commerce was represented, and also included was a hotel worker. Bearing in mind that every single industry was not covered by the union, we wanted to be sure that we were hearing from all angles. And the Labor Department sat at that meeting, discussed, and prior to having that meeting, the Social Welfare Department did its research. A breadbasket. How much would it cost for a family of 4 to have 3 good meals per day, pay their rent, electricity, water? In other words, we were looking for a livable wage. And when they returned with their information, we shared it with all of the parties. As the discussions progressed, they indicated that they needed to go back to their seniors, their advisors, whoever, and discuss whether or not that kind of payment was possible. And it was a big increase. And we understood that. But all of the parties were very reasonable. Very, very reasonable. It didn't happen overnight. It took a few weeks, going and coming and negotiating, and finally they agreed. And that was the first step, because after that, the minister had to be informed, the permanent secretary had to write the official document to cabinet. Cabinet had to meet, discuss it, agree. Then it had to be sent to the parliament to be debated. Then the Governor General had to sign to assent. And before it could become actual law, it had to be gazetted. And the government printery had a lot of work to do with gazetting and then printing the actual act. So a process was involved. And it highlights the point that the ILO made and that the PAM NRP government subscribed to, that universal and lasting industrial peace cannot be accomplished unless there is social justice. And that was the main reason for ensuring that our workers were looked after. We listened to them, we dialogued with them, and acted.
Good work, great work. And even now, we are reaping the fruits of your work and the work of all of those several members of the tripartite committee. So thank you very much from the whole country. Thank you very much for the work that you have done. It would last beyond your years, and your great-grandchildren would talk about the work that you were instrumental in doing for the benefit of the working class of St. Kitts and Nevis. We also spoke about when we met and were knocking heads about the situation on the industrial side, where a couple of factories closed down and left the workers locked out. And I think in one of those acts, some PAM made sure that it never happened again by provisioning in the act to make sure that these workers would be taken care of. Could you share with us what happened then?
Definitely. There's a severance payment section in the act. Basically what happened, it was mainly women who were affected. And a lot of these women had children. Mm-hmm. Many of them were single heads of households. So, it was really a burden for them. They showed up to work and met padlocks on the doors of certain of the factories. And when they inquired, they were told that the factory owners had left the country. They flew out, they worked up to the evening before, and took an early morning flight out. That meant that the trust week that was owing them, they couldn't get it. That meant they were out of work and didn't know where they should turn. It was a very painful experience for them. And the PAM NRP government decided that no worker should ever have to go through that again. And so the Severance Payment Act has provisions where employers and employees make contributions to Social Security and that money goes into the severance payment fund so that people can reap the benefits from that. And one of the benefits is if your factory closes down unexpectedly, you will be able to claim some payment to tide you over until you find employment. But it went further than that. A lot of these factories that came to our country came in on tax-free holidays. And when the tax-free holiday ended, many of them left, making the excuse that, oh, they found cheaper labor somewhere else. Mm-hmm. They would admit that the work coming out of St. Kitts was high quality, but they did not get that tax-free holiday renewed, and they flew. It meant that the workers then were at a disadvantage. Mm-hmm. There were other factories that decided, okay, we're going to restructure. Since we're not going to get all of these perks, we're going to restructure. And therefore, they made people redundant. So the Act covered all of that. If you were laid off, if you were made redundant, if something happened to your employer and as a result, your employment did not continue, that was taken care of. And the layoffs were considered temporary. And as a result, government decided if you're going to be laid off for more than 12 weeks, that's no longer temporary. You need to be fully compensated for that period based on the number of years that you've worked. And there's a calculation that was put into it. So mothers knew they could go home with food for their families, even if they were laid off, made redundant, or met a factory that closed down. Social Security had a duty then to ensure that every employer and every worker made contributions to the fund, because it was from that fund that the workers were paid.
Talk about social justice in action. And as an aside, but yet it ties into all of the good work, all of the excellent work that the People's Action Movement in government did to help and promote and advance and transform the working class of St. Kitts and Nevis. Let's not forget that it was the People's Action Movement government that also built the industrial site daycare center, so that even while mothers were next door working, they could probably find 5 minutes to slip across and see if their children were okay. They did not have to worry about, child care services. And I think over time, we became a sort of best practice for child care across the entire region. So, as you were talking, Mrs. Nisbett, I was thinking that the People's Action Movement really needs to learn to tell its story a little bit more vociferously, because people, I think over time, people take these gains for granted, and that is not the bad part. The bad part is when other people, other parties dismiss it or tell or don't or maybe minimize the impact that all of these things have had, without giving due recognition and due, I guess, props, if you will, to the work, to the tremendous work that was done based on foresight of a party that had the working class people at heart. And it's funny that we're saying working class, because people have always, there's some schools of thought that still exist till this day, that PAM was not a working class party. PAM, were planter class, and PAM look after people who are white collar. But look at all the things that you have just enumerated that PAM in office did for the benefit of the working class. And it cannot be denied. And maybe because people are not aware, they think that, these things came from a Labour government because, Labour is grassroots and Labour is... But truth be told, I said it earlier, I would say it again, from the look of it, the People's Action Movement in government did more for the working class than the Labour Party government.
But Laverne, let me add, that there's a little technicality to the whole thing. The civil servants who are on the ground doing the work cannot speak. They cannot defend themselves against accusations of not doing anything or not having things come to fruition. The ministers of government make policy. Mm-hmm. And I have no problem with anybody criticizing policy or criticizing the lack of policy. But it is very, very painful for civil servants when they hear that after so many years in office, the government did nothing. That is a slap in the face to the hard-working civil servants, and it is something that can demoralize the service, and I think it needs to stop.
I totally agree. Because at the end of the day, it is the technicians and the technocrats in government that do the work. As you say, the ministers only, well, they also create the policies. I guess the ministers take them to parliament and make them into law and all of that. But the real MVPs in all of this are the civil servants. But alas, you know, whenever we have come to realize that whenever there's a Labour Party government, a lot of things get dumbed down and people tend to retreat because they are scared and afraid. And I pray that the day would soon come when that is no longer the order of the day, because we really ought to be able to enjoy the fullness of democracy. I think many of us think that democracy is this one-sided thing, that because we have free and supposedly fair election, that is the full extent of democracy. But there are a lot of things that we need to get fixed in this country, and I certainly agree with that observation that you just made. And we also have to talk about Mrs. Nisbett, and I'm not sure, you know, I'm sure you were well around when this happened, but somebody reminded me when they saw the topic that we were advertising, not to forget to talk about the sugar workers bonus. I don't know if you could shed light on that, because you know, let me say, I am the child of working class parents. My father was a cane cutter, and he enjoyed sugar workers bonus. In fact, those sugar workers bonus helped me to buy my textbook, because although the People's Action Movement's social program did not really quite benefit me in terms of the free meals and the free textbook, I left school before those things kicked in. But certainly, when that bonus was paid, I was able to get my money to buy my textbooks thereafter. So let's not forget the work that PAM did in terms of the bonuses and the significant bonuses that were paid to our sugar workers.
Yes, you were right. But unfortunately or fortunately, I don't know which, I was transferred from the Labor Department to the Clarence Fitzroy Bryant College. And therefore, I did not have a direct hand in what was happening in that regard. But it was painful for people who had worked all the years and got only a pittance, when in fact they were entitled to more. So I would say that under the unity administration, the unity construct, which the People's Action Movement was a major part of, that government ensured that the sugar workers got what was rightfully theirs. They got their money. So how can we say that a PAM government is not for the working class? Were it not for the involvement of a PAM government, the working class might still be facing some of the age-old problems that it faced.
I certainly agree. So we're going to hear now some more misgivings on that was recently spoken about what it is that Labour did for their people. Some more, again, without fact checking these things these words are just spouted, and then lo and behold, we know that they were not accurate, they were not true. So we'll take in this this next soundbite?
So I would like to wrap up by finally saying that Labor Day is approaching, and I want to invite all our workers here in St. Kitts and Nevis to the Labor weekend celebrations. It's a weekend for workers. Let us not take our gains for granted. The fact that we have vacation, the fact that we have sick leave, maternity leave, 40-hour work week, and so forth. Those things were achieved because of a labor movement.
You heard the points that he enumerated. Take it away, Mrs. Nisbett.
Laverne, our Prime Minister is young, and he was certainly not involved at the time when number 6 of 1986 was being thought of, developed, and enacted. I don't think he was aware. And that is why I'm saying fact-checking is necessary. Let me share a personal story with you.
Sure.
Let us take just the maternity leave. No employer was compelled by law to give workers maternity leave. They did it out of company policy, and they determined how much time. So there was no formal legislation on that matter at that time. I happened to have one of my children under the Labor Administration and one when PAM NRP was in office. And let me explain the difference. In 1983, I got 30 days maternity leave, 30.
Wow.
And that included Saturdays and Sundays. Okay? So you know how problematic that can be for somebody who had not too long given birth. 4 years later, when PAM NRP was in office, 1987, I got 13 weeks maternity leave with pay.
3 weeks.
3. Okay? And at that time, women who were not married also got their 13 weeks. There was no discrimination that married women could have maternity leave, but unmarried women couldn't.
Wow.
No.
Wow. And so that maternity, that change to the maternity leave structure was piloted by the People's Action Movement, and I guess Dame Constance Mitchum as well.
Oh, Dame Constance Mitchum played a major part. She championed the cause of women, and she pointed out many days, look, women comprise over 50% of the population. You cannot accommodate half of the population and ignore the other half and expect the country to progress. She sang that song repeatedly and stood her ground. And she was right.
And what do you know about the 40-hour work week? I heard a gentleman, I think he was one of the founding members of PAM, or if not, he came on the heels shortly thereafter. And he is adamant that PAM is the one who also changed the work week to a 40-hour work week. Can you speak to that? Are you aware of that as well?
The Minimum Wage Act actually put a provision in because wages were tied to the hours of work. So a 40-hour work week meant that you were a full-time employee, and therefore your wages reflected that. Okay? Less than 40 hours was part-time. And so, yes, workers could not work 40 hours and be paid part-time pay. That was finished. You work full-time, you got full-time pay. You work part-time, you got part-time pay. And that was fair.
Right. Whew. Well, I hope our viewers are taking note. And I hope that those people who are hearing these things for the first time tonight would record them for future conversations. Our young people need to know. Our not so young people need to know that some of these major foundational benefits that they're enjoying today were as a result of the work of an active government who was standing in the gap and rooting for the working class of this country. And some of those things that you have listed tonight, they are nothing to sneeze at, because they really transformed and advanced our working class. We are talking about the transformation and advancement of working class as the main subject matter of this discussion tonight. And I am sure that everybody who's listening now understands that PAM did a significant amount of work to make sure that, in fact, our working class in St. Kitts and Nevis were transformed and advanced. I mean, from maternity leave to minimum wage to 40-hour work week to the fact that they can stay in the civil service or return to work in the civil service after pregnancy, even though they weren't married. I mean, these were transformational changes. And now that we have shared this program, I am hoping that every young person in St. Kitts, if they have not been able to look at the fullness of this program, would find a way to go back and fact check and get the information right, so that if in the future those two politicians who were misguided in those sound bites that we share tonight, if they were to again say any such thing, that they can say, no, we know better. We know better now. All of those things that you're talking about happened because of the foresight of a PAM NRP government. So thank you very much for sharing, Mrs. Nisbett. Now I understand that you are a teacher, and teacher by nature like to summarize and like to recap and like to make recommendations. And so I'm going to throw the floor open to you now to share some, because you know what? PAM people are kind people, you know. We are very considerate. And so we don't want to just keep all of this thing to ourselves. We want to offer some recommendations. I understand you have some to share tonight, so I'm giving you the floor to do so.
Thank you so much, Laverne. But before I share recommendations, let me point out that there are challenges, especially when it comes to negotiating the minimum wage. So, for example, there's a challenge to the union. If the union has already negotiated a wage, and then the proposal at the tripartite meeting proposes a wage much higher than what the union has agreed to, that creates a little problem. So they had to be part of the negotiating process. Let's look at the employers. They must know what their financial situation is. And at no time would we want an employer to either close down because they couldn't afford to pay workers, to lay off a number of workers, or make a number of them redundant. So there had to be that balancing act that we had to do in setting that wage and having everybody agree. And I must say that one of the striking features of the PAM NRP government is consultation. If you don't consult, you don't know what people are going through, you think you have the answers, and when you put things out there, then it shows that there really wasn't the kind of thought put into it. I am a firm believer that before any serious bit of legislation goes to the final stage, that there must be public consultations. When you look at things like the Labor Minimum Wage Act, number 6 of 1986, we're talking bread and butter issues. These are not things that we can take lightly. So now to my recommendations. I'm looking at the roles that people have to play. The media is considered the fourth estate. They have a duty to educate. And while it is good to have call-in programs talking about just every and anything, they must also have those call-in programs to discuss the critical issues that affect people in the workplace. The ordinary man or woman might say to you, I have difficulty accessing the legislation. I know some years ago, a lot of the laws were put into one book and it was very expensive. We have a public library. All of the legislation should be in that public library for anybody, student, adult, ordinary man and woman in the public to go in and read, get informed. The government has the duty to consult. And I need to stress, consultations are critical. You don't consult, you don't have all the answers, and you can go wrong. The other group I'm appealing to are the citizens. Citizens of St. Kitts and Nevis, please read widely, listen, ask questions, be informed. When you make a decision, it should be an educated or informed decision. The unions all have their roles to play. And there's a critical role of educating the workers. Workers must know what their rights and responsibilities are. I had the privilege of going to the Barbados Workers Union and seeing the work that was going on there in worker education. And I think it is time for our unions to step up to the plate. Our aim is industrial peace and harmony. It can be achieved, but everybody has to play a role.
Thank you. I mean, if I were to echo those same things, I would echo it 4 and 5 times over. Thank you so much, Mrs. Nisbett. This was a lesson. I did promise that tonight would be a veritable lesson, and it was. Because you know, the way you broke down the act and the way you brought context to this discussion really did a lot for the discussion. Because again, we are not a people who like to read, and if in fact we like to listen, then listen to somebody who knows. Please don't listen to people who will come back to apologize and say that they misspoke. We don't want to have a nation of misspeakers, if there's such a word. We want people, when they speak with authority, because they know the facts. So thank you so much for sharing. It was quite the pleasure. We are so happy that this would be a record for posterity. People can go back and check again and fact check again, because I am confident that all that you said tonight brought enlightenment to a lot of listeners, a lot of viewers. I am so happy that you were able to make it. Thank you so much for the work that you have done and for the work that you'll continue to do, because you may not be here, but we know how to reach you.
Anytime. You're very, very welcome. Thank you.
Thank you so much again. And for me to wish you a happy Mother's Day, and to wish all of our viewers a happy Mother's Day on Sunday when it comes, especially our hard-working mothers across St. Kitts and Nevis. And to remind everyone that this program is growing in interest and it is growing in numbers. And so if you feel inclined to give a donation to make sure that you see it every Thursday, you can drop your donations off at our secretariat, put it in an envelope, no matter how small it is. If it is $1, $2, a coin, drop your envelopes off to the secretariat. We're open on Saturdays from 10 to 2 p.m. and label your envelope for Perspectives so that we could, we can keep this program going. We are about enlightenment. We are about providing education to the people of St. Kitts and Nevis, and we are committed to using this platform to do so. So thank you very much for viewing. We'll see you again on the next edition of Perspectives next Thursday. Goodbye, everybody.
The chorus is
that God has blessed so well. In peace and love and happiness, we will forever dwell. We ask for God's protection and guidance. People's Action Movement was strive from day.
Good day, citizens and residents.
We love to serve our country that God has blessed so well. In peace and love and happiness, we will forever dwell. We ask for God's protection and guidance on our way. The People's Action Movement will strive from day. This country been run by our brother goats, the greediest of all time. They have all a self and none of the mentality. The chorus is bunch of pigs and goats running this nest day. And the latest deception and betrayal is really cause for alarm. They're the greediest of all time, it is plain.